Russia has always been known for its military prowess, boasting impressive numbers, raw power, and terrifying weaponry. This characteristic applies to both the historical Red Army and the modern armed forces of the Russian Federation. However, while the Red Army was a formidable force in its time, how does it compare to the Russian military of 2020? We've previously explored the differences between the Russian soldier and their American counterpart, but today we're delving into a unique comparison, Russia versus its own history. We will analyze the strengths and weaknesses of each army, from combat history and equipment to size and training, to gain a deeper understanding. Let's start with the past, exploring the army of the Soviet Union. The development of the Soviet Union's military was significantly influenced by Russia's defeat in World War I. Following the formation of the Red Army in 1918, it embarked on a journey to develop new strategies that would ensure victory in future conflicts. They abandoned traditional military practices in favor of innovation, embracing a mobile warfare strategy that incorporated tanks and aircraft to break through enemy lines. This willingness to adopt novel tactics led to a series of significant victories for the Soviet military during World War II, particularly the iconic Battle of Stalingrad, which is credited with turning the tide of the war in favor of the Allied forces. It's important to note, however, that the USSR suffered heavy casualties, with close to 1 million soldiers lost in both the battles from Moscow and Stalingrad, despite their triumphant victories. The Soviet Union maintained its military might following World War II, emerging with an army that, according to some sources, numbered between 10 and 13 million men. After Germany's surrender, the troop count was reduced to 5 million, and a renewed focus was placed on modernizing and innovating the military's methods. In 1951, the legendary AK-47 was introduced as the Soviet infantry's primary weapon. In 1967, the Soviet Union commissioned the BMP-1, a groundbreaking new infantry fighting vehicle. Soviet military power only increased with the introduction of nuclear weapons, and by 1986, the Soviet Union had the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, boasting an estimated 45,000 warheads. Beyond its global military might, the Soviet military played a critical role in the Soviet Union's economy. During the 1980s, the Soviet Union's military employed approximately 1/5 of its adult citizens. By 1989, the number of Soviet citizens working for the military in some capacity had risen to 1 in 4. This close relationship between the economy and the military was both a blessing and a curse. Prioritizing military production over other domestic sectors allowed for a substantial allocation of resources to the military. However, it also meant that when the military suffered, the economy suffered, and vice versa. As time passed, the Soviet military encountered a number of challenges. One notable issue for the Soviet military was its involvement in the war in Afghanistan. The military spent a decade in the region, incurring significant financial and human costs, costing nearly $20 billion annually, before Gorbachev withdrew the troops in 1989. As the years passed and the collapse of the Soviet Union drew nearer, the size and strength of its military began to decline noticeably. In 1985, the Soviet military had approximately 5.3 million men, less than half its numbers after World War II. By 1990, the military's ranks had dwindled to about 4 million men. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the Russian military numbered 2.7 million men. This drastic reduction in soldiers was attributed to a variety of factors. One primary factor was the economic decline of the Soviet Union. As the economy began to falter, the military budget was cut. There was also a degree of unrest among the Soviet population regarding the treatment of soldiers in the Soviet army, who were perceived by the public to be living under unacceptable conditions. This information coming to light led many to resist conscription and refuse to join the military ranks. This stands in stark contrast to modern Russia, where due to increased pay for soldiers and improved living conditions in the military, the number of professional soldiers outnumbers the number of conscripts. When comparing the Soviet military to the military of contemporary Russia, it's important to specify which era of the Soviet military is being discussed. In the 1940s, the Soviet military had access to national resources, as well as resources provided by the United States Lend-Lease program, which granted the Soviet Union access to a significant number of aircraft, tanks, and other materials essential for military success. However, by the 1990s, the Soviet military was no longer the formidable military force it once was. The modern Russian military is considered one of the strongest in the world, often ranked alongside China and the United States. With unofficial estimates placing its numbers at nearly 20,000, the Russian military boasts more tanks than any other country in the world, exceeding the combined tank forces of all NATO countries. While other countries reduced their tank capabilities after the end of the Cold War, Russia did not follow this trend. For comparison, Germany currently has around 300 tanks, while France and Britain each have approximately 250. However, it's crucial to note that most of Russia's 20,000 tanks are mothballed Soviet-era relics that would require weeks of repairs to become combat ready. And even then, they would likely perform poorly against modern tanks. Russia also surpasses many other countries with its air force. Russian military analyst Alexander Goltz, though potentially biased in favor of his homeland, stated that Russia's air force is much stronger than the Chinese for now. However, even with a stronger air force than China, the number of Russian combat aircraft is a small fraction of the Soviet Union's. In 1986, the Soviet Union had approximately 11,400 combat aircraft, while Russia, as of 2014, has only around 1,571. The total number of armed forces has also decreased significantly, with around 5.1 million Soviet armed forces in 1986, dwarfing the modern Russian count of approximately 800,000. One reason for this notable decrease in size is simply the change in population since the decline of the Soviet Union. In 1990, the Soviet Union's population was over 287 million people, whereas the current Russian population sits at around 145,929,171. With a population nearly halved in size, it's understandable that the number of Russian soldiers would have also decreased significantly over the past several decades. An additional challenge facing the modern Russian military that other modern military powers are not dealing with is the lack of modern technology. Russia lags behind in the development of drones, radar, and surveillance. During the Soviet Union, the economy's purpose was largely to produce resources for the military and to maintain a state of perpetual readiness for war. When the Soviet Union dissolved, those resources dwindled. However, even though the modern Russian military falls short of the United States and China in terms of technology, it has still made improvements on classic Soviet military technology. One example is the Su-25 attack plane, an iconic Soviet aircraft that the Russian military has continued to develop new versions of to this day. The Su-25 is a ground attack aircraft designed for bombing raids and low-altitude attacks, earning it the imposing nickname Flying Tank. As the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the modern Russian military seems to be adhering to that mentality when it comes to many of its military vehicles. While the modern Russian military has made improvements on Soviet technology, the issues of manpower and lack of resources remain significant. When the military is stretched too thin, it becomes not only a weakness, but also a potential cause of dangerous, even disastrous consequences. According to researcher Igor Sutyagin, several recent Russian military failures, including Air Force crashes, are the result of limited resources being pushed to their absolute limits. Regarding 3 Russian Air Force crashes in 2015, Sutyagin stated that this could be an interesting sign of the overstretching of Russian armed capabilities, because the maintenance template for these vehicles does not take into account the much higher operational tempo they have been operating under lately. In essence, there had been an increase in modern Russian military operations without a corresponding increase in resources available to the Russian military. However, since 2016, there has been a decrease in this type of report, suggesting that the issue of overstretch has been at least partially addressed. Russia has implemented a significant number of programs to enhance its military in recent years. But will this give it a potential edge over its Soviet predecessors? Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, stated that the armed forces are now arriving at a fundamentally new level of combat readiness. And in many ways, this appears to be the case. Beginning in 2011, Russia increased military funding. Richard Connolly, director of the Center for Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Birmingham, evaluated Russia's commitment to financially bolstering its military, saying that the share assigned to procurement of new equipment and modernized equipment and research and development is significantly higher than for any other major power. Over the past several years, Russia has acquired more than 250 long-range ballistic missiles and upgraded nearly 1,000 military helicopters. They also added more than 1,000 new combat planes over the course of 8 years. Connolly highlighted Russia's historical commitment to funding its military, stating that even when their economy is not doing well, they still make sure they allocate a large proportion of output to military spending. This holds true when looking back at the Soviet military, just as it holds true for the Russian military today. So, returning to the initial question, how does the Soviet military compare to the modern Russian military? On the one hand, the Soviet military possessed massive numbers and an impressive military record, along with vast collections of military vehicles and equipment. On the other hand, the modern Russian military has had time to rebuild from the fall of the Soviet Union, learn from its mistakes, and bolster Soviet military technology with modern improvements. It ultimately comes down to an issue of manpower versus technological advancement. While the modern Russian military has undoubtedly made significant strides, it doesn't seem to be as powerful as the military of the Soviet Union was, even as the USSR approached its decline. While the success of the Soviet military is often attributed to its sheer volume and its ability to outnumber its opponents, that was not always the case. While there were claims from German forces in World War II that they lost to the Soviet army because they were outnumbered in overwhelming quantities, it appears that was, at least in a few significant cases, not true. While the Soviet army outnumbered the Germans 4-1 in 1945, many historians argue that the ratio of Soviet to German soldiers was often much more even. In fact, it has been claimed that at the famous Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviet army was outnumbered by the German forces with a ratio of 1.61. Despite this, the Germans were still defeated in this conflict. Therefore, it's impossible to attribute the success of the Soviet military entirely to its numbers alone. It's clear that innovation and growth are crucial for the Russian military now, just as they were for the Soviet military during its formative years. However, Russia doesn't approach all of its conflicts from a place of direct military action like the Soviet Union did. The country now employs other methods, including cyber warfare and digital espionage, to gain an advantage over its opponents. Analyst Timothy Thomas states that Russia, as a modern force, often utilizes indirect, asymmetric, and non-military measures rather than direct military force. While the strategies are different and the population numbers have significantly decreased, it's clear that the military is a top priority for modern Russia, just as it was for the Soviet Union, and the country is striving to maintain its status as a top military power, even if it couldn't quite recapture the raw military strength of its Soviet glory days.